Picture this. Hamilton, Ontario, 1889. A boy stands at the edge of a frozen lake, his breath clouding in the January air, his boots soaking through where the ice has begun to give way at the shore. He is 9 years old. His name is Aubrey Thomas Forsythe. And in his coat pocket, pressed against his ribs, is a piece of folded paper. A hymn he copied by hand from the church bulletin because he wanted to keep it. Not because anyone told him to. Because something in the words would not leave him alone. That is the thing about Aubrey. Something in him was always listening for something no one else could hear. His father, a machinist at the Otis foundry, was a practical man. Good hands, straight back, no patience for what he called the dreaming kind. His mother kept the house on Barton Street with the kind of quiet devotion that does not announce itself. She baked bread on Thursdays, read the Psalms on Sunday mornings before anyone else was awake, and never once, in all the years Aubrey could remember, raised her voice in anger. She was the kind of woman who carried her faith the way some people carry a lantern, not to show it off, but because the road is dark and you simply need to see. Aubrey was the middle child of 5, not the oldest, who inherited responsibility, not the youngest, who inherited affection. He was the one who disappeared into corners with books, who asked the kind of questions that made the Sunday school teacher look uncomfortable, who once spent an entire Saturday afternoon lying on his back in the backyard staring at the sky and told his mother afterward that he had been thinking about eternity. She did not tell him to go play with the other children. She sat down beside him in the grass and said, quietly, that eternity was worth thinking about. That moment stayed with him. For the rest of his life, it stayed with him. By the time Aubrey was 14, he was good enough at figures to help his father keep the accounts for a neighbor's dry goods shop on King Street. By 16, he had taught himself rudimentary German from a grammar book borrowed from the public library, because he had read that many of the great theologians wrote in German, and he wanted to read them without translation. He did not tell anyone this. It was not the kind of thing you announced in the Foundry District of Hamilton, Ontario, in 1896. He attended Centenary Methodist Church with his family, sat in the same pew every Sunday, sang the hymns with the same measured voice as everyone around him. From the outside, there was nothing remarkable about him. A thin young man with ink on his fingers and a habit of arriving early to sit alone in the sanctuary before the service began. But inside, something was building. He could not name it then. He would spend the rest of his life trying to describe it, and the best he ever managed was this. It felt like hunger, but not for food, like thirst, but not for water, like standing at the edge of something enormous, and knowing with absolute certainty that you are being called to step forward, and not knowing at all what the stepping will cost you. He was 18 when the crisis came. It arrived, as crises often do, not with thunder, but with a quiet knock. A Thursday morning in late November. His mother came to find him in the small room he shared with his younger brother Edwin, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and she said the doctor had been, and that his father was not well. Not well was a careful phrase. What it meant, as Aubrey would learn over the following weeks, was that his father's lungs had been quietly filling with the fine metal dust from 30 years at the foundry, and that there was no medicine for what that did to a man, and that the most they could expect was perhaps another year. Perhaps if he rested. A machinist with 5 children and a mortgage on a house on Barton Street. The world that Aubrey had assumed would unfold in a particular way. Apprenticeship, a trade, perhaps some kind of ministry. The future an open question but a peaceable one, rearranged itself overnight into something harder and more immediate. He left school. He took his father's place at the foundry. He was 18 years old and he did not complain, because complaining did not seem like a thing that would help anyone. But at night, after Edwin was asleep, he would lie awake with that old hunger pressing against his ribs like something alive. He began around this time to read in a way he had not read before. Not the curious, exploratory reading of his boyhood, moving from one book to another, like a boy wandering through a field. This was different. This was a man in a burning house looking for water. He read the New Testament through 3 times in 6 months. He read the Psalms aloud in the dark because something about hearing the words in his own voice made them land differently. Not as poetry to be admired, but as dispatches from someone who had been where he was. who had been afraid and exhausted and certain that God had either forgotten or gone quiet for reasons no one had explained. My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" He had read that verse 100 times. It did not comfort him the way comfortable verses comfort people. It did something stranger. It made him feel accompanied. The hunger did not go away. If anything, it deepened. In the spring of his 19th year, something happened that no one who knew Aubrey Forsythe ever fully accounted for, including Aubrey himself. He stopped sleeping more than 4 or 5 hours a night, not because of insomnia. He would set himself to wake at 3:30, and he would wake, and he would dress quietly in the dark while Edwin slept. And he would go downstairs to the kitchen table where his mother's Bible sat, and he would read and pray until the light came. He told no one. There was nothing to tell exactly. He was not doing something dramatic or remarkable. He was doing something private in the way that breathing is private, necessary, involuntary, not performed for any audience. What changed over those months of early mornings is difficult to explain in the language that most of us use for most things. Aubrey himself was not given to mystical language. He was, at his core, a practical man in the tradition of his father, not a man who chased experiences or catalogued visions. But he would say, later, that the Bible he had read since childhood began, in those early mornings, to read him. That the words did not change, but the words began to do something to him that he had not felt them do before. He described it once, in a letter to a colleague, as the difference between studying a map of a country and actually crossing its border. The map does not change, but suddenly you are breathing the air. The prayer that accompanied the reading was not eloquent. It was often not even articulate. He would sit at the kitchen table in the January dark. The stove ticked and settled, and he would say, sometimes aloud and sometimes only in his chest, "I do not know what you want from me, but I am here, I am listening. Whatever it costs, I am listening." His father died in March of 1902. Aubrey was 22. The grief was clean and deep. The way grief is when you loved someone plainly and they were simply gone. He did not fall apart. He arranged the funeral with his brother William. He sat with his mother in the evenings. He went back to work at the foundry because the family still needed money, and he was now the eldest working man in the house. But something had shifted. The foundry, which he had endured out of love and duty, now felt like a room he was standing in by accident. Not wrong exactly, but not the room he was meant to be in. He began quietly to serve in whatever capacity the church needed him. He taught the young men's Sunday class. He visited the sick in the neighborhood, not because anyone asked him to, but because he had time on Wednesday evenings, and the widow Calloway 3 streets over had not been to church in 2 months, and he thought she might appreciate a visitor. He was not trained for any of this. He had no credentials, no formal study, no particular gift for public speaking. His early attempts at leading the class were stilted and self-conscious, and he knew it. He did not stop. He kept the early mornings. He kept the reading aloud. He kept the unglamorous, unwitnessed prayer at the kitchen table while the rest of Hamilton slept. He told his mother once, when she found him there at 4 in the morning and asked what he was doing, that he was not sure exactly, but that it felt like preparing for something he did not yet know the name of. She put her hand on his shoulder and said nothing. She understood. The years that followed were not spectacular. They were not the kind of years that make for clean biography. There were failed experiments, a brief attempt at correspondence Bible college that he found intellectually stimulating but spiritually dry, a year of working as a Sunday school superintendent for a circuit of small rural churches west of the city, traveling by train and wagon to congregations that could barely fill a schoolroom. A season of profound doubt in the winter of 1905, when everything he had built his interior life on felt as thin and unconvincing as paper, and he sat at the kitchen table in the dark and could not open the Bible for 3 weeks because he did not know what to do with a faith that had gone suddenly silent. He has never spoken about those 3 weeks publicly. It appears in one journal entry and nowhere else. I have not heard anything. The silence is complete. I do not know if I have been mistaken about all of it. I am choosing tonight to stay. He stayed. The silence broke, not dramatically, not with light and thunder, but the way winter breaks in Ontario. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, until one morning you notice the snow is melting at the edges and something underneath is still alive. By 1907, Aubrey Forsythe was 37 years old. He had no seminary degree, no published works, no reputation outside a cluster of Methodist congregations along the Lake Ontario shore. What he had was 20 years of early mornings, 20 years of a discipline that no one had watched or rewarded or celebrated, 20 years of the unglamorous hidden practice of a man who believed, against all present evidence, that preparation was not wasted even when the thing you were preparing for had not yet arrived. It arrived. The story of what came next is not easy to compress, because it unfolded over decades and involved thousands of individual human beings who each deserved their own careful accounting. But the shape of it can be told. In the spring of 1908, Aubrey accepted an invitation to speak at a small mission hall on James Street North, a wooden building that smelled of coal smoke and old hymnals. A congregation of perhaps 40 people, mostly working-class men and women who arrived straight from the factories, still smelling of iron and oil. He was not an accomplished speaker. He had not been trained as a preacher. He was, by his own description, a plain man with a plain message. But something happened in that room. He spoke, without notes, which surprised him, because he had spent a week preparing notes about what it meant to believe that God was present not in the cathedrals and the polished pews, but in the kitchen at 4 in the morning, in the grief of a father's death, in the 3 weeks of silence when faith had gone thin and he had chosen, stupidly or stubbornly or by grace, to stay. When he finished, a man in the third row who had not been to church in 11 years asked to speak with him. His name was Gordon. He had come to the mission hall because his wife had begged him to come, and he had come to prove to her that none of it was real, and he sat in the third row with his arms crossed for 20 minutes, waiting for the performance to start. He told Aubrey afterward, "I came to watch you fail. I did not expect you to say anything true." Gordon became the first of many. Aubrey did not take the healings lightly. He did not take them lightly because he had watched too many people exploit desperate faith and leave behind rooms full of people who felt foolish afterward, who had believed something and been disappointed and then stopped believing anything at all. He was careful, methodical almost, the way a man is careful with something that can break. He prayed for people privately, without crowds, without spectacle. He documented what happened. He wrote letters. The letters became a correspondence network. The correspondence network became something that historians of Canadian Pentecostalism would later describe as the first systematic attempt to connect scattered pockets of revival in Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritime provinces into something coherent. A shared understanding of what was happening, and what a record of healings and transformations that might otherwise have vanished into individual memory and been forgotten. Aubrey Forsythe never intended to build anything. He was not, at heart, a builder. He was a listener, but it turned out that listening, practiced long enough and with enough discipline, produced something that looked, from the outside, like architecture. There is a detail that those who knew him in his later years never forgot. By the time he was in his 60s, Aubrey Forsythe was waking at 3:30 every morning. He had done this for 40 years. His wife, Margaret, a quiet, perceptive woman from Dundas, who had married him knowing exactly what she was marrying, once told a friend that she had never once, in 30 years of marriage, known him to sleep past 4. She said it not with irritation, but with a kind of reverence, because she had also seen what the mornings produced. She had watched him go to pray over a child in Brantford, who the doctor had given up on. And she had been there when the child's mother called 3 weeks later, crying too hard to speak clearly, because the child had recovered in a way the doctor could not account for. She had watched him sit with a man in Guelph who had not left his house in 2 years for reasons no one could diagnose. And she had watched that man, 6 months later, shaking Aubrey's hand at the door of a church he had not been able to enter since his wife had died. Margaret did not talk about these things to impress people. She talked about them in the matter-of-fact way that people talk about things they have watched happen with their own eyes. The price, she said once, to a young woman who was asking about her husband's secret, "What is the secret?" was simply this: he paid it before anyone was watching. He paid it for 20 years in a kitchen in Hamilton before anyone knew his name or cared whether he existed. And by the time people came to see what God was doing through him, there was nothing left to build on except what had already been built. In secret, in the dark. He was 81 years old when he died. The year was 1961. He had spent more than 60 years in the early mornings, in the unwitnessed hours before dawn, in the discipline that no one photographs because there is nothing photogenic about a man alone at a kitchen table with a Bible and a silence he is learning to inhabit. The number of people who wrote to his family after his death, not famous people, not theologians, but ordinary people, factory workers and school teachers and farmers' wives from small towns across Ontario, ran to several hundred letters. Most of them said some version of the same thing, that he had prayed for them, or spoken to them, or written to them at a moment when they had been close to abandoning everything, and that something had changed, and they were still here, still believing. Because of that, a few of the letters were from people who did not remember his name. They had met him once, briefly, decades ago, and they described a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a habit of listening in the way that most people do not listen, as though whatever you were saying was the most important thing he would hear all day. They did not know who he was. They had not known then either, but they had not forgotten the conversation. There is a moment, near the end of one of his later journals, undated, written in the shaky hand of his final years, where Aubrey Forsythe wrote something that neither Margaret nor his children could fully explain, because it referred to something none of them had witnessed. It was a single sentence. The woodshed was cold and the candle kept going out, and I did not know for many years whether any of it was true. But I stayed, and God met me there, and everything else is the record of what happened because of that. No one knows which woodshed he meant. There is no shed on Barton Street in the surviving records. His children did not remember one. Perhaps it was literal. Perhaps it was metaphor for something that happened in a winter that was not recorded anywhere except in one man's bones. What is recorded? In letters. In the accounts of those who knew him. In the quiet trajectory of his life from a 9-year-old boy with a hymn in his coat pocket to an old man who had spent 60 years waking before the sun, is the shape of a life lived according to a discipline that most of us consider, then set aside. He did not consider it heroic. He was not by temperament a man who considered himself heroic about anything. He considered it simply the truth, that the things that matter are built in the hours no one sees, that the power, if there is power, comes from the price, that the price is always paid before the witnesses arrive. He paid it in the dark, at the kitchen table, in the long Canadian winters before Hamilton woke up. He paid it in the years of silence and doubt and unglamorous faithfulness. He paid it before he had any reason to believe it would amount to anything at all. And then, quietly, over the course of a lifetime, it amounted to everything.